illustrations that I am going to play for you today. If I find I'm running a little short on time, I might skip one or two, but then listen to them at home and ditto the recommended listening list. And then the third page is a description of sonata form, which is terribly important in the music of the 18th and 19th centuries, the classical and romantic eras, because I'll be referring to sonata form and what Beethoven does with it a great deal during this course. And then last but not least, at the back on your very last page is a copy, one of the many translations into English of the Heiligenstadt Testament, which I'll be dealing with, of course, briefly today. What can one do with 1 hour? Okay, let's begin. And thank you for joining me on this Beethoven journey. So it's traditional when studying a composer's output for it to be divided into creative periods or phases. And many musicologists have attempted to organize Beethoven's life and work in this way. So, excuse me, from as many as 2 to 5 phases have been postulated, as well as transition works composed between the periods. Now, it was the French composer Vincent d'Indy who suggested the titles for Beethoven's 3 periods: imitation, externalization, and reflection. And because these are such a wonderful analogy of his output, I have used these as the titles for the next 3 lectures. So this morning, we'll be concentrating on Beethoven's first style period, that of imitation, which he takes us up to 1802, when he reached a crisis point with his increasing deafness and wrote the famous Heiligenstadt Testament. His first period has been designated one of imitation because he began by composing in the classical style of his celebrated teachers, Mozart and Haydn, and other significant older contemporaries of the classical period. Today, I'll also briefly tell you a bit about his ancestry. Where did this talent come from? And his period of apprenticeship. But first, let's begin with some music from the overture to his ballet, The Creatures of Prometheus. Second theme. In 2005, I went and stayed with a friend in Cologne, and we caught the tram to Bonn to visit Beethoven's birthplace house museum. And it was a very moving and, for me, a very spiritual experience. Bonn is located on the western bank of the River Rhine, the city founded by the Romans in around 12 BC. And this may explain the continual presence of the Romans behind Beethoven's thinking, with their stern code of courage and citizenship and their great classical literature. And as we've seen from the books found in Beethoven's house after his death, he loved the classics. Since the 13th century, Bonn had been the capital of the electors of Cologne. Clemens August, a grandiose builder and enlightened patron of the arts, may have been responsible for bringing the Beethovens to Bonn. So on his travels to Flanders during the early 18th century, he apparently heard a young boy singing in a church with a pleasing voice, and he invited him into his service. The boy came from a Flemish family with the name van Beethoven or Beethoven, which literally means of the beet garden, as in beetroot. The young singer Ludwig was the son of a tailor or a baker, we're not terribly sure, and became the grandfather of one of the greatest composers the Western world has ever produced. He rose to the position of Kapellmeister, in English, master of the chapel, in the elector's court in Bonn. And this was a very prestigious position for a musician in those days. His son, Johann, was born in 1740, was also a singer in the elector's service with a fine tenor voice. He also taught the piano and singing to supplement his income. In 1767, he married, against his father's wishes, a widow named Maria Magdalena Leim, the daughter of the elector's head chef, Heinrich Keverich. And in those days, of course, musicians were still regarded as servants on the same level as the cooks or the gardeners. And Maria herself was a chambermaid, Beethoven's mother. They had 8 children altogether, the first of whom, Ludwig, died at birth. Then the second born was also a son, who they named Ludwig again. And then followed his brothers, Caspar Anton Karl and Niklaus Johann, and then 3 more boys who did not survive infancy, and then the only girl, Maria Margareta Josepha, who died as a toddler. It's assumed that our famous Ludwig was born on the 16th of December in 1770 because his baptism is recorded as the 17th. And in those days, they quickly baptized babies in case they would die. So his birth could be the 16th, 17th, possibly even the 15th. It's not certain. We know very little about Beethoven's first years, except that when he was around 5 years old, his father began teaching him the violin and the clavier. Now, the clavier is a sort of generic word for the keyboard instruments of those days, the harpsichord, the very early piano prototypes. And he forced him to practice for long hours, to the point of tears. And he often beat the boys in a drunken rage. And his gentle, loving mother apparently seemed unable to protect the boys from their eccentric and often penniless father. He just drank away his salary. So Ludwig gave his first recital on the 26th of May, 1778. His father lied about his age, saying that he was 6 when he was actually 7.5, hoping to make a profit out of this, passing him off as a child prodigy, as Mozart had been. In the gymnasium, Ludwig learnt Italian, Latin, and French, and many of his letters are written in French as well as German, a little bit of Italian, as were Mozart's. In fact, most Europeans, even today, can speak several European languages, especially if they're in neighboring countries. Beethoven apparently found maths difficult and never learned how to multiply. He could subtract and add, but couldn't multiply. Obviously, he didn't have the sort of teacher I had in Standard 1 that drilled the times tables into us. Anyway, of course, music is the maths, the mathematics of sound, and he had no problem with that. The organist of the Mennonites church in Bonn gave him organ lessons and an organ post for 6 o'clock mass every morning. Quite a task for a young boy. So this was the situation in 1779 when a gifted musician, one Christian Gottlob Neefe, came to Bonn, appointed as the new director of the National Theatre. And here at last was someone who recognized Ludwig's talent and ensured that it was gently nurtured without being stifled by strict rules and conventions. With Neefe's support, Ludwig's first compositions were published, some sonatas and sets of variations, in which his own individual style could already be seen. In 1783, when he was 13, he was proficient enough to become deputy harpsichord player in the Archbishop Elector's court orchestra, now Maximilian Friedrich, and assistant court organist with an annual salary of 150 gulden or florins. He was now a wage earner, to the great relief of his family. We don't have much information about his life during the years when he was 14 to 17 years old, but we do know that he was deeply involved with music. He was surrounded by professional musicians. He learned a great deal. He became familiar with church music in the Elector's chapel and learned about the workings of an orchestra playing the viola in the Elector's ensemble. He heard current music in the opera theatre and at the musical gatherings of wealthy amateurs. When the new Elector acceded in 1784, Archduke Maximilian Franz, he was the 10th of Empress Maria Theresa's 15 children, Bonn became a cultured and lively center of the arts. In 1786, Max Franz inaugurated the new university in Bonn. He encouraged science and education and abolished torture. In 1787, Beethoven traveled to Vienna to meet Mozart, who was then aged 31. And Mozart was most impressed with the young 16-year-old's incredible skill at improvising variations on a given theme. "Keep your eyes on him," he remarked. "Someday he'll give the world something to talk about." So Mozart gave Beethoven some lessons, which accounts also for the Mozartian style in some of Beethoven's early works, especially the first piano sonatas, which we'll scrutinize presently. But Beethoven had to hasten back to Bonn because his mother was critically ill with what we know today to be tuberculosis. And she died on the 17th of July, leaving 3 sons aged 16, 13, and 11, and the toddler, Maria, who died 5 months later. Ludwig loved his mother profoundly, and of course her death seriously affected his mental and physical health. In fact, his health was poor throughout his life of only 56 years. He hated his father, and who proceeded to go downhill rapidly after his wife's death. And Ludwig, not yet 19, was compelled to become head of the family. And because of Johann's ineptitude, part of his salary was actually given to Ludwig in order to manage the household. Meanwhile, the enlightened young Elector Max Franz noticed and favored the young composer. His court was pervaded with an innovative spirit and the spirit of revolutionary France, and he didn't bestow favors according to birth, but according to individual merit. Of course, Marie Antoinette was then Queen of France and the Elector's baby sister. In May 1789, the elector enabled Ludwig to enter Bonn University and to study German literature there. Of course, this is also the year in which the French Revolution breaks out, the greatest movement for freedom the world had yet known. And Beethoven was profoundly affected by these ideas of liberté, égalité, and fraternité that the revolution unleashed. And this new order of things meant that Beethoven could be at ease with his first aristocratic friend, Count Ferdinand von Wolfstein, a keen amateur musician, 8 years his senior. And he gave Ludwig a piano, as well as becoming the well-known dedicatee of the well-known Waldstein Sonata, which I'll play for you tomorrow. He also furthered Ludwig's education by taking him to performances of Shakespeare's plays and introducing him to works by Kant and Lessing, Schiller and Goethe. So Ludwig was also willing to ghost for the Count, and the music of the Ritter ballet, or Knight's ballet, for example, was ostensibly written by von Waldstein, but was in fact composed by Beethoven. In 1790, Beethoven's now 20 years old, he met Haydn, who was passing through Vienna on his way to London. And 2 years later, the elector granted him paid leave to go and study with Haydn in Vienna. In 1792, this was a great year of political turmoil in Europe. France was declared a republic, and Napoleon declared war on Austria. By October, the French revolutionary armies were approaching the Rhine. So in November, Ludwig bade farewell to his friends in Bonn, from which he was never to return, and hastened to Vienna. Bonn had become too limiting for Beethoven, even though he had enjoyed great esteem there, including from the elector Max Franz himself. But the 22-year-old composer, of course, wanted much more, and he set his eyes on the glittering capital of music and contemporary culture, where all the arts enjoyed fertile ground for growth. Empress Maria Theresa's successor, her son, Emperor Joseph II, founded the Burgtheater, and the imperial court, where Salieri was now Kapellmeister, of course had its own orchestra. And noble patrons vied for one another to employ the best musicians, the most talented composers, the best singers, to perform at private concerts in their salons. Public concerts were still few and far between at this point in time. And most of the music that was performed was done so in the palaces of the wealthy and the aristocracy, their chateaus and townhouses. Italian opera was all the rage and performed in a chain of beautiful Baroque opera houses reaching from Dublin right across to St. Petersburg. And this was, of course, a public forum for music. Amusing, effervescent, and gay, the Italian opera style perfectly matched the Viennese personality. In 1792, Mozart had been dead for a year. Haydn is now 60. Beethoven's father also died that year, leaving the young composer in charge of his surviving siblings, Karl and Johann. By June 1793, the elector's payments had ceased due to the presence of the French army and Max Franz's flight from Bonn. But unlike Mozart before him, Beethoven had arrived, as I went into yesterday, at just the right moment in music history for a brilliant freelance musician. And with the help of the Elector and Count von Waldstein's introductions, he immediately entered the most illustrious circles in Vienna. And recognizing his genius, a noble sponsor, Prince Karl Lichnowsky, gave Beethoven rooms in his villa, a horse and a groom of his own, and an annual salary of 600 gulden. If anyone knows anything about ancient currencies, if they can figure out what that is in rands today, please let me know. He was also befriended by Count Lichnowsky's brother, Prince Lobkowitz, and Baron von Gleichenstein, all of whom became generous and significant patrons. And the whole point is that, freed from the obligations of composing music that was prescribed by wealthy patrons, Beethoven was able to write what he wanted when he wanted, not having to worry about where the next money was coming from. It's also important to remember that during his first years in Vienna, Beethoven was admired primarily as a concert pianist and a mighty improviser, performing mostly his own compositions, which were regarded as extraordinarily skillful and daring for those days. These were dangerous times, with Napoleon's troops almost at the city gates, but he still managed to maintain his humor. In a letter to his publisher, Simrock, dated August 1794, Beethoven wrote, "Many persons of importance have been arrested. They say there was fear of a revolution breaking out, but it is my belief that so long as an Austrian gets his brown beer and sausage, there will be no revolution. The gates in the suburbs are ordered to be closed at 10 o'clock at night. The soldiers have loaded guns. One dare not speak too loudly, otherwise the police will accommodate you for the night." 1798 was the year of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, and that was when the Rosetta Stone was discovered in the desert by his troops. As a teacher, Beethoven soon attracted pupils from amongst the most brilliant young professionals in Vienna and the most elegant young ladies of la noblesse, with some of whom he fell hopelessly and passionately in love. He engaged in open competition with other pianists already established as stars in Vienna, and scored his first victory in March 1795 with a performance of his second piano concerto, music charged with power and depth hitherto unheard by Viennese audiences. as it says in your notes, it's actually Martha Argerich who's playing, not Wilhelm Kempf. You can hear it's a woman. With Beethoven, German music, which had been overshadowed by the Italian style for 2 centuries, came into its own. And as this course progresses, we'll find out about the next generation of significant German composers who followed in Beethoven's wonderful example. By the end of the 18th century, music was no longer the exclusive preserve of royal and wealthy patrons, but had begun to be enjoyed by the lower social strata as well, in the newly built concert halls with paid seats. A man of liberal ideas, Beethoven always believed that music should be enjoyed by all, irrespective of class or financial circumstances. The audience applauded this second piano concerto enthusiastically. Of course, we're very familiar with it today, but they asked uneasily, why has this man come to trouble us? Until then, great composers like Haydn had written music for the salon. Now this young upstart commanded attention with powerfully realizing philosophy in music. He made his audiences think. The aristocracy understood the genius of the new composer and paved the way for his rise to fame. Prince Lichnowsky diligently practiced Beethoven's piano works to prove that they were indeed playable, and placed his string quartet of fine professional musicians at his disposal. So in our sonata form, here's the first theme or subject. The bridge passage, if you look at your notes on sonata form, taking us into another key. Into the second subject. Meanwhile, Beethoven studied hard. The lessons that he had begun with Haydn earlier on in his first arrival in Vienna, he continued with for over a year. Luckily, Haydn was one of those perspicacious teachers who allowed his students to follow their own instincts, and Beethoven was no easy pupil. Although he later denied it, he clearly owed much to Haydn. Mozart, with his example in matters of form and style, was significant too, but it was Haydn's grounding that was so significant, and actually the starting point of some of Beethoven's most innovative, bold moves in music. Humility was not one of his attributes during this first period in Vienna. Democracy and its ideals were a rising tide in France and rapidly spread through Europe, while Napoleon Bonaparte was rising through the ranks of the French army to become the greatest military leader in a millennium. Beethoven observed these events with interest and believed that he too possessed the power to conquer the world. Noble ideas, of course, had always attracted him, and after the liveried servitude of the Bonn orchestra, it was a giddy emancipation to be a free resident in a palace, and under the generous patronage of his powerful friends, his creative powers flourished. His work at this stage was rather patchy, very advanced in some areas and rather backward in others, as a consequence of his haphazard training in Bonn. But he continued his studies with the famous pedagogue Johann Albrechtsberger, and also with Mozart's one-time rival Antonio Salieri. So by the time his first piano trios and sonatas were published, he had begun to make his mark in Vienna. Before we take a closer look at these significant early works, it's important to consider 4 other composers who greatly influenced Beethoven's first period works. You may not know their names, but they were pretty significant in Europe at that time. So we've got Muzio Clementi, one of the first composers to write music for the piano rather than the rapidly declining harpsichord, and Beethoven later met him when Beethoven, was 37. Another influence was Leopold Anton Kozeluk, one of the first Czech composers to migrate towards Vienna at the end of the 18th century. Then Luigi Cherubini was a significant influence, especially his dramatic opera style, which had a huge impact on Beethoven, especially with Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio, as we'll see presently. I'll tell you more about that tomorrow. The quintessential romantic rescue opera. And Beethoven demonstrated the Germanic commitment to structure from the outset, which makes his music so much easier to listen to and easy to analyze when you know what's going on. It's a very compact or expanded, but a very definite sonata form or expansion thereof. He had little use for the classical style galant, still in vogue in the 1790s, and although difficult in his piano compositions, it's important to note that virtuosity was always used in the service of a musical idea. He didn't write splashy compositions just for the sake of showing off his fantastic technique. The idea, the musical idea, was always the most important. So by 1800, some of his best-known compositions had been published, including the Pathétique and Moonlight piano sonatas, and his first 2 symphonies. The first 3 piano sonatas were all dedicated to his teacher, Joseph Haydn. And although still classical in form, they already carry that unmistakable Beethoven stamp and energy. Mozart's and Haydn's sonatas were mostly composed in 3 movements in the pattern fast, slow, fast. But with his first piano sonatas, Beethoven introduces a 4th movement. So in his first sonata, we still have a classical minuet and trio for the 3rd movement, followed by an energetic 4th movement. So listen to the graceful curtsies still present in his minuet in this first sonata, although in a rather heavy-handed minor key. Curtsy, a nod to the classical era. And this is the trio section. and then it goes back to the minuet. So it's an A-B-A form with minuet trio, and then the minuet is repeated again. But in the second piano sonata, Beethoven dispenses with the classical minuet, and what we have next is a vigorous scherzo. I'm trying to get this to get to the next piece. My cursor disappears off the screen sometimes. Listen to the difference. Not a classical minuet, but a scherzo, which is Italian for joke. So we see Beethoven already introducing changes. Instead of the minuet, the scherzo and trio. And this habit persisted into his orchestral works as well, using the scherzo. So he wrote, as I mentioned yesterday, 32 piano sonatas altogether, and they're a wonderful place or forum in which to observe his evolution as a composer and what he does with sonata form. So as you also have in your notes, here is the basic structure. We have the first subject or theme in the home key that we call the tonic in music. Then there's a bridge passage into another key, and then the second theme or subject in a different key, a related key though. Then a little codetta to finish off that section. Then we have the development section, which explores those themes, and then the recapitulation is where the whole lot comes back again, but in the tonic. So it's also a tertiary form, an ABA form. Let's listen to it in practice in this piano trio. So here's the first subject. A trio for violin, piano, and cello. Bridge passage, moving into another key. Subject in E flat major, different mood, different feel. Haydn heard and praised the first three of Beethoven's piano trios, but it was this third one that disturbed him. He thought that the public would not understand or accept it, and that they would be disconcerted by these extremes of tempo and dynamics and texture and adventurous harmonies, never mind the emotion. Well, of course, Beethoven completely ignored Haydn's warnings to cool it and published increasingly sophisticated and daring music, including his 8th piano sonata, the Pathétique, which starts with a slow introduction ahead of the first subject. Well, this sonata was the most revolutionary and striking work Beethoven yet produced. He was only 29. Do any of you know any 29-year-olds? Can you imagine them composing this? Musical ones, I mean. The word pathétique is misleading to English speakers. It connotes more the feeling of passionate or emotional, with perhaps an overtone of the original Greek word for suffering, pathos, which gives us the word pathos. Also in C minor, Beethoven's favorite key, and another crowning achievement of this first period, was the 3rd piano concerto. The first movement is in sonata form, with the entire exposition first played by the orchestra, as was the traditional classical format of Mozart, then repeated with the piano solo. And as it's fairly long, quite a few minutes, I'm cutting in right where the piano comes in very, very boldly. So this is the first subject. Bridge passage, moving into another key. Second subject is now in a major key, different mood and feel altogether. Beethoven's friend Ignaz von Seyfried turned the pages for him when he first performed this in public, and he said it looked like Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was just sort of little notes and scribbles to give him a rough guide, because of course he had the whole concerto from memory already in his head. He composed his 5 piano concertos, of course, for his own performance in Vienna. That was his plan, to be a concert pianist. Of course, we have no recordings of him. It's too long ago. So it's very interesting to read contemporary accounts of his playing. And here's a contemporary account from 1791. This man shows real virtuosity. His ideas are almost inexhaustible. He is more expressive, more meaningful. In short, he appeals more to the heart, quite apart from the question of his skill. His technique is so different from the traditional technique of piano playing, as if he wanted to develop a completely individual approach. And this is what keeps coming across in contemporary reports, that his playing wasn't necessarily better than other people's. It was just very different. The composer Carl Czerny, who later became one of his pupils, described his playing as spirited, grandiose, full of feeling and romantic. Tone paintings of a very high order. The pianoforte, which is its proper full name, the soft loud in English, made rapid progress at this time. Its design decisively influenced by these great composer performers of the day, including Beethoven. It's also interesting to read what people wrote about Beethoven as a teacher. And what particularly appealed to me was his method of where he let a student finish playing a section or a piece first before he started to make comments and criticisms. And I, for one, can speak of a piano teacher I had when I was about 14 or 15. The one I really loved had been fired from the school, and another one came in and she nitpicked at every bar. She reduced me to tears. I couldn't finish a section. So terribly important to just let the student have their say and then have your say after that. Whatever the state of Beethoven's hearing at this time, it didn't seem to be affecting his piano playing yet. He undertook concert tours to Prague, Berlin, Nuremberg, and Dresden, where his improvisations were especially successful. But he began noticing a distressing phenomenon. When the applause began, he would hear an excruciating, rushing sound in his ears, like a waterfall. And this was when he was only 26. So, in spite of frightening episodes like this, 1801 was an even more fruitful year than the previous one had been. He scored his greatest hit with his ballet, The Creatures of Prometheus, his brilliant Opus 18 string quartets, the exquisite Spring Sonata, which, by the way, is being played at Christchurch Constantia on a nearby, a soon Sunday in February. When is it, Margie? The 2nd? The 2nd of Feb. And his technique, people comment, was radically different. He wanted to develop a completely individual approach, and this is what distinguished Beethoven from his contemporaries. Never mind his tremendous skill at improvising. People would suggest a theme and say, all right, now just improvise a set of variations on that theme. And he did, and he just blew them away with his originality and his skill. Full of romantic feeling. This is what Czerny says about his playing. But what I want to play you next, there are some lovely pictures of his pianos, and they're in that Bonn museum, is this the opening of this lovely Spring Sonata in sonata form, the first movement. So here's the first subject. bridge passage, taking us to another key. Second subject. Perhaps 1801 was also such a fruitful year because Beethoven was in love with the beautiful 17-year-old Countess Giulietta Giocardi, one of his pupils. And let me take this opportunity to advertise. As I mentioned yesterday, if anyone could come up with a place and a time, well, Munro Bloch has very kindly organized for me to give my lecture about Beethoven's women, the muses who inspired him, at the Ezekiel Museum next Wednesday at 5:30 for 6 o'clock. The change from the 18th to the 19th century is synchronized with a great change in Beethoven's personal life. Up until the end of the 18th century, he'd been the young man of genius, arrogant in his power, riding his turbulent nature upon the winds of liberty, equality, and fraternity that had blown away old class structures and creeds in Europe. But as 1799 passed into 1800 and 1801, he crossed the Rubicon that sundered him forever from his hoped-for career as a virtuoso and divided his creative work from its first period. Already for 2 years or more, a horrible spectre had begun lurking. He, Beethoven, whose hearing had been to him his most noblest faculty, was becoming deaf. At first, the deafness was slight, and it could be passed off as absent-mindedness. But by 1800, it had worsened to the extent that he avoided all social gatherings for fear of being found out. He realized that there was no likelihood of a cure by around 1801 and believed that his career as a performing soloist was ruined. And this was a mental agony that he could only really share with these two most trusted friends, Virgile and Amenda. Amenda was his doctor. And of this personal tragedy come glorious music such as this song, set to a poem by Friedrich von Mattheson, Adelaide. Something of this tremendous struggle